It began like any other trip, a routine flight over the majestic Andes Mountains. On October 12, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D turboprop carrying 45 people took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. On board were the Old Christians Club rugby team, along with their friends and family, excited for an exhibition match in Chile. Inside the cabin, there was a carefree holiday atmosphere. The young rugby players laughed and joked as the plane cruised onward, utterly unaware of the danger forming in the skies ahead. They had no idea their journey would soon turn from joy to terror, and that they were about to become unwilling protagonists in one of the most harrowing survival stories of all time. The flight encountered bad weather, forcing an overnight stop in Mendoza, Argentina. By the next afternoon, Friday, October 13, 1972, the weather cleared enough for a second attempt. For the superstitious, Friday the 13th was an ominous date for flying. But spirits were high as the Fairchild aircraft finally ascended and headed west toward the towering Andes. The pilots navigated a narrow mountain pass, relying on their instruments amid intermittent clouds. Many passengers remained relaxed, even playful. Inside the passenger compartment, there was a holiday atmosphere. Author Piers Paul Reed described as some team members strummed guitars and sang. Others gazed out the windows at the breathtaking peaks piercing the sky. Unbeknownst to them, a deadly chain of errors was unfolding in the cockpit. The inexperienced co-pilot, Elt. Dante Lagurara, made a critical navigation mistake. Believing they had cleared the Andes, he began descending far too early, while they were still deep in the mountains. N.Wikipedia.org. By the time the pilots realized their error, a jagged ridge loomed directly ahead. The Fairchild lurched violently as it hit turbulence. Some passengers chuckled at the bouncing, but then came a sudden stomach-dropping plunge. That was probably the moment when the pilots saw the black ridge rising dead ahead. One survivor recalled later. The pilots pulled up sharply, engines straining, and the aircraft climbed almost vertical, rattling as an alarm blared through the cabin. In the rear, 21-year-old Fernando Nando Parrado instinctively gripped his seat. Beside him, his mother Eugenia and 19-year-old sister Susanna exchanged worried glances. Across the aisle, Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, felt his heart pound as he realized something had gone terribly wrong. At 3:34 p.m., terror struck. The Fairchild's belly scraped a ridge, and the right wing sheared off, taking with it the tail section of the fuselage. The gaping rear of the plane ripped open to the freezing air as passengers still strapped to their seats were sucked out into the sky. An instant later, the left wing snapped off. The fuselage, now just a crippled tube with engines screaming, went into a free fall down the remote mountain slope. Inside, those who remained on board clung on and screamed in panic. Nando Parrado was thrown forward with tremendous force. His head smashed against the bulkhead, knocking him unconscious. In seconds that felt like eternity, the fuselage hurtled almost out of control. Then, with an earth-shaking boom, it slammed into a steep snowfield and careened down the glacier at over 200 miles per hour. The white hull of the fuselage slid like a toboggan down the slope for over 725 meters, before finally plowing into a snowbank. Inside, seats tore loose and bodies were flung about violently. When the wreckage came to a rest, an eerie silence fell over the high Andes. It was broken only by the howl of mountain wind and the cries of the injured. Of the 45 souls on Flight 571, 12 were dead in an instant. Both pilots perished on impact, along with several passengers in the rear who were swept out when the tail tore off. In the crushed cockpit, Colonel Julio Ferrada, the pilot, was killed instantly, and co-pilot Lagara died moments later. 3 crew members and 9 passengers died immediately in the crash. Those who survived were battered, bloodied, and in shock. 33 survivors emerged from the wreckage, many with grave injuries. Young Marcelo Perez, the team captain, somehow survived the crash and crawled out onto the snow. He stared in disbelief at the shattered remains of the plane scattered across a glacier, 12,000 feet high in the Argentine Andes. Around him lay the bodies of his teammates and loved ones. The thin mountain air was filled with moans of pain and panicked shouts. The survivors quickly realized they were stranded on a desolate, icy slope with no civilization in sight. The afternoon sun was already sinking, and the temperature plummeted below freezing. They had to act fast. Those who could move began helping the wounded. By a stroke of luck, two of the rugby players, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, were medical students, and they triaged the injured as best as possible. The scene was gruesome. Nando Parrado lay unconscious with a skull fracture. His sister Susanna was barely conscious and badly hurt. Another young woman, Graziella Mariani, had both legs broken, pinned under seats. A man named Enrique Platero was found with a metal rod impaled in his abdomen when Roberto Canessa carefully pulled it out. Loops of intestine came with it. Despite their own fear, Roberto and Gustavo moved from one survivor to the next, binding wounds with torn cloth and offering words of comfort. Their makeshift first aid saved lives that day. As daylight faded, the reality set in. They were trapped on a remote mountain at 3,660 meters altitude, with no rescue in sight. The wind howled through the gaping rear of the fuselage, where the tail had been. In a desperate bid to shelter themselves, the group pulled luggage, seats, and debris to plug the open end of the fuselage. They huddled inside that battered tube as an icy night fell. The first night was endless. In the thin air, oxygen was scarce, and the cold was beyond anything the Uruguayans had ever experienced. The night was unending. One account recalls, temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius on those high slopes. The fuselage offered scant protection. The survivors had only light autumn clothes, now torn and soaked with melting snow. They had no blankets or coats. Throughout the night, the fuselage echoed with muffled sobs and prayers. Eduardo Strau, a 25-year-old, later confessed that first night was really impossible to describe. They were crammed shoulder to shoulder in darkness, surrounded by the bodies of friends who had died on impact. Some survivors cried out for their mothers, others simply cried. In these long hours, several of the gravely injured succumbed to their wounds. By dawn, another 5 people had died, including Nando's mother Eugenia Parrado, and others too wounded to hold on. Each death hit the group with a cruel finality. They were utterly alone, and even fewer remained alive. Morning light brought a measure of hope and a full view of their situation. The fuselage was half buried in snow at the bottom of a steep valley, encircled by towering jagged peaks. The sky was crystal blue, and the brutal cold of night eased with the sun. The survivors emerged slowly from the wreckage, blinking in the blinding snow glare. All around, the Andes stretched in every direction, an ocean of white, barren mountains. There were no trees, no signs of life or human presence. 18-year-old Carlos Carlitos Paez, one of the youngest survivors, stood atop the broken fuselage and turned full circle. In every direction, he saw nothing but snow and rock under an endless sky. It hit him that no one knew where they were. They had vanished into the Andes. Despite the despair, team captain Marcelo Perez and others tried to keep morale up. The group organized themselves to improve their odds. They rationed out the scant supplies that had been found in luggage and seat. In total, they had just a few chocolate bars, some candies and nuts, a tin of mussels, a bit of jam, and a few bottles of wine, all meant to feed 27 people now clinging to life. It was barely enough for a day, let alone the weeks of survival they might need. Marcelo ordered that each person eat only a fragment of chocolate or a sip of wine per day. They melted snow for water using metal wreckage placed in the sun. By night, they squeezed together inside the fuselage to share body warmth. rotating spots so no one person stayed too exposed at the drafty opening. These young men and women, students, athletes, sons and daughters, were learning to survive as a community. Eduardo Strout later described how they formed a tight fraternity in those days, sharing tasks, taking turns sleeping in the least cold spots, and encouraging each other to hold. In those early days, faith played a big role. Stranded at 12,000 feet, many survivors were devout Catholics, and they prayed frequently for rescue. They even improvised a makeshift altar in the snow, using broken pieces of the plane, where team member Liliana Methal would lead group prayers each evening. Others, however, began to question how God could allow such suffering. Looking at the lifeless bodies of his mother and friends, Nando Parrado's faith was shaken. "What good is God to us now?" he muttered bitterly. Yet, in that hell of ice and desperation, prayer and hope were among the few comforts they had. Days passed with no sign of rescue planes. The survivors did everything they could to draw attention, stamping SOS in the snow and laying out luggage in bright patterns. But the high mountain terrain and fresh snow camouflaged the wreckage from above. Unknown to them, search and rescue aircraft actually flew near the area multiple times, but the white fuselage blended into the snow and was missed. Each time they heard an engine drone in the distance, the group would rush outside, waving pieces of debris and desperately yelling. But every plane passed by, disappearing over the mountains. On the 8th day, the remaining food truly ran out. They had been starving for over a week, and many were growing weak. In their desperation, some tried chewing on pieces of leather, shoe leather, and bits of torn seat covers, hoping to get some calories, or at least trick their stomachs. But the leather and foam provided no nourishment. It only made them feel sick. The survivors' bodies were slowly consuming themselves. "We had long since run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plain," Roberto Canessa said, "and there was no natural vegetation or animals. Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food." Then came October 21st, 1972, a date none of them would ever forget. That afternoon, the survivors were lounging listlessly inside the fuselage when Roy Harley, 20, caught a crackling message on their little transistor radio. They had scavenged a single working radio from the wreckage, and each day they strained to listen for news. Now, as everyone fell silent, the voice on the radio delivered devastating news. The search for Flight 571 had been called off. The group sat in stunned silence as the reporter explained that authorities had given up hope of finding survivors in the Andes. In Montevideo, their families would soon hold memorial services. Here on the mountain, that announcement was like a death sentence. Coach Inciardi, one of the rugby players, recalled the moment with despair. "That's the day we all died," he said quietly to the others. Nando Parrado, awake from his coma but grief-stricken over his mother's death and sister's fading life, clenched his fists. Several survivors broke down sobbing. They felt utterly abandoned by the outside world. Eduardo Strout remembered, "Absolutely devastating. We felt abandoned, and we felt so angry with everybody, even with our families, with the world, with God, with nature, with everything." That night, despair enveloped the fuselage. Some talked about giving up, perhaps slipping into the snow to die. Others, like Team Captain Marcelo, tried to rally the group, insisting they must not lose hope. By the next morning, a fragile resolve took hold. With no rescue coming, they had to save themselves. Eduardo Strout said they realized very quickly that the only way to get out would be by doing it by ourselves. Nando Parrado, despite mourning his mother and now watching over his dying sister Susana, felt a firelight inside him. He refused to let this be the end. They began discussing plans. Perhaps someone could hike out of the mountains to find help. But looking at the gigantic peaks surrounding them, that seemed an impossible task in their weakened state. Meanwhile, a more immediate crisis grew: starvation. With no food left, survival was a matter of days. The survivors grew lethargic and skeletal. Nando's sister Susanna, who had hung on in agony for over a week, finally slipped away on day 9, despite Nando's desperate attempts to keep her alive. Her death hit Nando hard. His entire immediate family was gone, yet it also steeled his determination to save his friends. The living were now surrounded by 16 corpses in the snow. Grimly, they moved Susanna's body outside to join the others. Each body was placed in the snow just outside their makeshift shelter, the cold air preserving them. It was a growing cemetery on the glacier, and a constant, agonizing reminder of their plight. As hunger gnawed at their bellies, a terrible idea began to take root in each survivor's mind. They were devout Catholics. Even the thought of it was repulsive, taboo, perhaps a mortal sin. But day by day, the logic became harder to ignore. Their bodies needed protein and energy, or they would all die. Everything they needed to survive was right there, in the flesh of their dead companions. The notion surfaced in quiet, guilt-ridden whispers among small groups. Could we eat the bodies? At first, most tried to push the thought away. Some prayed for guidance. Nando looked at the frozen corpse of his mother outside and felt sick to his core. Our story is described as cannibalism, he would later say, but cannibalism is when you kill to eat. In our case, it was about survival. These people they were contemplating eating were their friends, family, teammates. How could anyone cross that line? On a particularly cold morning, Roberto Canessa finally spoke the words out loud. He locked eyes with his friend, Rafael Etzavaren, whose mother had died in the crash, and said plainly, "We're going to have to eat these bodies." A hush fell. Some were horrified, others strangely relieved that the unspeakable had finally been spoken. Eduardo Strauss remembered hearing his cousin Adolfo Fito Strauss say out loud what everyone had been thinking, and it gave him a kind of relief. If they were going to die anyway, why not do everything possible to live? Slowly, the survivors came to a grim consensus. If I die, I consent. Use my body so that others might live. They even compared it to the act of Holy Communion in the Bible. In one emotional discussion, Nando Parrado addressed the group, invoking their faith. Christ gave his body for us in the Last Supper. We're doing the same, taking strength from our friends to keep us alive. One by one, they nodded in agreement. They shook hands and made a pact. If I die, please use my body, Nando said firmly. So at least you can get out of here and tell my family how much I love them. And so, the survivors prepared to violate one of society's greatest taboos in order to survive. On the frozen ground lay the bodies of people they had loved. Many were teammates and friends. Among them were Felipe Macquarian, Susana Parrado, Liliana Methel, Gui Rodriguez, Franzini, Magri, and others. Each a person cherished by someone in that fuselage. Consuming them felt like a betrayal. Of course, the idea of eating human flesh was terrible, repugnant. Survivor Ramon Sabella later said, "It was hard to put in your mouth, but we got used to it." In their minds, they reframed it not as an act of aggression, but of sacrifice and love. The deceased would help save the living. Roberto Canessa, weighing the morality, thought to himself, "If I die, I would be proud that my body could be used to help the others." The first attempt was the hardest. The group chose the pilot's corpse as the initial source. Perhaps because some felt the pilots were indirectly responsible for the crash, and it would be easier to start with someone they didn't know well. With a shard of glass from the wreck, Roberto Canessa made the first cut into the cold flesh of a body. Nearby, others turned away, shaking and whispering prayers for forgiveness. He sliced thin strips of skin and muscle and laid them on a piece of metal fuselage to dry in the sun. We laid thin strips of frozen flesh aside on a piece of sheet metal, Canessa recounted. Each of us finally consumed our piece when we could bear two. One by one, they forced themselves to swallow the tiny slivers of flesh. Some retched at first. For others, the sheer horror made it hard to lift the food to their lips. It had no taste, Eduardo Strauss said, just an eerie, cold texture. The initial bites were done in tears and silence. It was very difficult to get it in the first day, Eduardo admitted. They were very small pieces of frozen meat. It doesn't taste like anything I got used to. In the end, I was absolutely disconnected from the origin of that food. The survivors struggled deeply with guilt. Some whispered last rites over the bodies. Others rationalized that this was not a sin, because it was done out of survival, not malice. All were Roman Catholic, and a few initially feared eternal damnation for what they were doing. But as days went by, most made peace with the necessity. They even found guidance in scripture. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. By eating, they believed, their friends continued to live inside them, sustaining them. In Montevideo, Father Luis Inspiro, the priest who counseled the families, would later assure the world that these boys committed no sin, stating that in such extreme circumstances, the preservation of life overrides traditional moral laws. In fact, years later, Pope Paul VI and later Pope John Paul II would officially absolve the survivors of any wrongdoing. It was survival, not murder. In the eyes of the Church, it was akin to an act of communion and faith, not a crime. Over the following days, consuming the flesh of the dead became part of their routine, an unspeakable act that they turned into something almost reverent. They dried strips of muscle in the sun, rationing small pieces each day. At first they could only stomach the outer flesh, skin, muscle, fat. They avoided organs or anything that looked too human. But as weeks passed and their hunger persisted, they cautiously harvested organs as well. Hearts, lungs, even brains. Finding these provided vital calories. The bodies kept cold by the alpine temperatures became precious lifelines. This gruesome sustenance gave them strength to continue, but it also weighed heavily on their conscience. Still, as the hunger pangs subsided, a grim clarity took hold. They now had a means to stay alive until rescue could come, if it ever would. Survivor Alvaro Mangino later said that paradoxically, the act brought them closer together. Each time they shared a meal of human flesh, they also shared an unspoken vow that such a fate would not be in vain. The Andes had done so much to crush us, our bodies were weakening, but our humanity survived. We hadn't let the mountains steal away our souls. Nando Parrado wrote of that period. Indeed, their humanity showed in the way they treated one another, with compassion, sacrifice, and even dark humor to cope. One afternoon, a few of the boys made a tongue-in-cheek menu for dinner, listing the names of their fallen friends as the courses. It was morbid humor, but it helped some of them accept what they had to do with a lighter heart. In their minds, they weren't cannibals or monsters. They were ordinary young men in extraordinary circumstances, doing what any person would do to keep their hope alive. By late October, 2 weeks into their ordeal, the survivors had settled into a desperate routine. 16 days of starvation, thirst, and bone-chilling cold, but they were still alive. The date was October 29, 1972. Inside the fuselage that night, 27 people packed themselves in tightly and braced as a furious blizzard raged outside, shaking their broken plane. Snow blew in through every crack. It was pitch dark. They could only hear the wail of wind. Many couldn't sleep and sat shivering, telling stories or praying. Around midnight, with a thunderous roar, disaster struck again. Without warning, an avalanche of snow careened down the mountain and slammed into the fuselage, burying it completely under a wave of white. The metal shell groaned and collapsed inward under the weight. Those inside were thrown against each other as snow poured through the gaps, engulfing them. In an instant, their tiny shelter became a tomb. You don't see, you don't hear, you cannot move, and you are dying, is how Roberto Canessa described the horror of that moment. He and the others were now entombed alive, packed tight in an icy grave. Panicked screams and cries filled the cramped space, as survivors struggled to breathe. The avalanche had filled the fuselage interior with dense snow, pinning everyone. Some managed to claw an air pocket around their faces. Nando Parrado, who had been sleeping near the front, miraculously found a small void of air. He shouted for others to calm down and conserve oxygen. But in those first terrifying minutes, several people suffocated under the snow. When the chaos settled, 8 of the survivors were dead, including team captain Marcelo Perez and Nando's close friend, Liliana Methel, the last remaining woman. Nando himself had nearly been crushed. He only survived because another friend, Pedro Algorta, had fallen across him in such a way that a pocket of space was left around Nando's face. In total, the avalanche instantly cut the group down from 27 to 19 survivors. And yet, incredibly, 19 still lived, but they were trapped. The fuselage was now buried under meters of snow, plunged into darkness and silence. For 3 long days and nights, the survivors cowered in a space no larger than a closet. A 3-foot by 3-foot air pocket they managed to clear, pressed up against one another. They had almost no water, and their bodies were numb. All sense of time was lost in that dark, cold purgatory. To stay alive, they periodically scooped bits of snow to eat, and took turns at a tiny gap near the roof of the fuselage, sucking in what little oxygen filtered through. Twice, Nando lost consciousness from lack of air and had to be resuscitated by Roberto. In this claustrophobic hell, it would have been so easy to surrender, to simply drift into endless sleep. But they refused. "We're not going to die," Nando shouted hoarsely, more to convince himself than anyone else. When the storm finally abated on the 3rd day, the survivors mustered their last ounces of strength to dig out. Using a metal pole and their frozen hands, Nando and Roberto punched upward at where they hoped the surface was. On the morning of day 19, a faint glow appeared as they broke through sunlight. They crawled out one by one, gasping fresh air and blinking at the bright world. The sky was clear and blue again, as if nothing had happened. But 8 fresh mounds of snow inside marked where their friends had died. There was no time for tears yet. They simply sat in the snow, breathing deeply and thanking God they were alive. The avalanche had not only taken more of their group, it also stole what little sense of security they had left. Their shelter was devastated. Still, there was one grim upside. The avalanche had delivered to them new sources of sustenance. The bodies of those who died in the slide were now the only food they had. Their only option for food was to eat from the bodies inside the fuselage that did not survive the avalanche. A report later noted matter-of-factly. Roberto Canessa felt his stomach churn at the thought. These were dear friends who had just been talking moments before. "It's a very, very humiliating thing to eat a dead body," Canessa said softly. But as he knelt by the corpse of his friend Enrique Platero, Roberto thought of something that pushed him onward. "I thought of my mother, that I had the unique chance of telling her not to cry anymore, that I was alive. And to do that, I had to buy time, and to buy time, I had to eat the dead bodies." With profound sadness, the survivors once again resorted to consuming their fallen companions, this time raw, as they had no strength or space to dry the meat. It was harrowing beyond words, but it gave them the calories to continue, crawling out of that snowy tomb. The remaining 19 survivors embraced one another. They stood in a circle in the snow and prayed over the fresh graves of those lost in the avalanche. Nando Parrado silently thanked his sister Susanna for watching over him as an angel. He was certain it was her spirit that kept him alive in the avalanche. Despite unimaginable loss, an even deeper determination was born in Nando, Roberto, and a few others. They realized more strongly than ever, no one was going to find them. They would have to save themselves. Winter was turning to spring in the Andes, and the worst of the weather might soon pass. It was time to act. November arrived, bringing slightly warmer days on the glacier. The survivors had now been stranded for over a month. Against all odds, 16 of the original 45 were still alive, 19 had survived the avalanche, but 3 more would soon die of injuries and illness. Numa Torquati, one of Nando's closest friends, was suffering from a severe leg wound that had become infected. Despite eating, he grew weaker by the day. Arturo Nogueira's legs, broken since the crash, had turned There was little Roberto and Gustavo could do beyond ease their pain. Day after day, the group watched their friends deteriorate, knowing rescue might come too late. Yet, amid the despair, a spark of hope ignited in the form of a discovery. Early in November, Roy Harley and others ventured to where they thought the plane's tail might have ended up earlier. From a high point near the fuselage, someone had spotted a glint of metal farther down the glacier. On November 17th, a small team led by Nando Parrado and Antonio Tintin Vizintin hiked for hours through knee-deep snow and finally found the detached tail section of the Fairchild. Inside, they hit a modest jackpot. The tail held a case of crackers, some candy, a few stray luggage bags with cigarettes and clothes, and most importantly, the aircraft's battery and a portable radio. Excitedly, they hauled these supplies back to the main fuselage. The warm clothing, extra sweaters, jackets, and even a bottle of cologne boosted morale. One survivor splashed on cologne jokingly, saying he wanted to smell nice even if he died. But the biggest hope was the radio. If they could power it with the battery and get a signal out, maybe they could call for help. For days, the survivors tinkered with the radio equipment, trying to jury-rig an antenna and connect the hefty battery from the tail. Roy Harley, who had some technical know-how, and Pancho Delgado worked tirelessly on it. However, they faced a crushing disappointment. The battery was low on charge, and the radio would not transmit. No matter what wires they twisted or prayers they uttered, they could not call out. After one especially frustrating attempt, Roberto Canessa slammed his fist in the snow. It was a dead end. It was like, if we can make the radio work and call for help, let's do that instead of risking our lives. One of their friends, Ramon, recalled thinking, but it simply wasn't possible. The mountains kept their dreadful silence. With the failure of the radio, only one option remained. Someone had to climb out of the Andes and find help. The survivors discussed who would go. The trek would be deadly. They estimated it could take multiple days, with no guarantee of success. Roberto Canessa and Nando Parrado volunteered immediately. Though Roberto was a bit leaner and weaker after weeks of rationing, he was clear-headed and driven. Nando, who had now recovered fully from his head injury, had an almost ferocious will to live. He wanted to fulfill the promise he'd made to himself as he sat by Susana's deathbed. He would get off this mountain and tell their story. Initially, they considered bringing a larger team. Antonio Tintin, Vizintin, and Dalton Nogueira were suggested, as was Numa Torquati. But poor Numa's infected leg meant he couldn't go tragically. Numa would pass away from gangrene on day 60, just before the escape attempt. In the end, the team decided on 3 climbers: Nando, Roberto, and Tintin Vizintin. Tintin was strong and hardy, and he had been one of Nando's closest compatriots on the mountain. The rest of the survivors agreed to remain at the fuselage, conserving their strength, while the expeditionaries tried to bring back help. If the climbers failed, it would at least be a quicker death in the attempt than slowly wasting away. The group spent weeks preparing for this great expedition. They saved up portions of flesh to give the climbers extra food. They modified pieces of insulation, foam, and sleeping pads from the seats to create a crude sleeping bag that could keep the trio warm overnight in the open. Pancho Delgado stitched together the sleeping bag with copper wire and insulation material, while Roberto Canessa oversaw its design, knowing that without it they'd freeze to death in a single night outside. They fashioned snowshoes from seat cushions and luggage straps to walk on the powdery slopes, using sunglasses found in luggage and visors from the pilot's cockpit. They created improvised goggles to protect from snow blindness. Their clothing was pitifully inadequate. just multiple layers of rugby jerseys, cotton shirts, and women's slacks pulled over their legs, but they reinforced them by wrapping plastic and seat fabric around their shins and arms. Everyone contributed whatever they could: extra socks, pieces of cloth, even red baby shoes that Nando's mother had bought in Mendoza. For a family friend's child, they turned those into padding for warmth. On December 12, 1972, after over 2 months in the mountains, the 3 expeditionaries were as ready as they could be. Nando Parrado Roberto Canessa and Antonio Vicentin kissed their friends goodbye and set off westward, up the steep slope behind the crash site. The others watched them go with a mix of hope and fear. "If we never come back," Nando told the group, "eat my share of the food." He meant the human flesh they were rationing. Even in leaving, he was ensuring the others would have a tiny bit more to eat. They carried strips of dried human meat, some chocolate saved from the tail, and a bottle of water melted from snow. Each man wore several layers of clothes and crude boots made from rugby socks and aircraft insulation. Nando carried his father's razor to use the mirror for signaling and a picture of his family. Roberto carried a map drawn on a piece of paper, based on what they guessed the terrain might be, and Tintin carried the hope of everyone left behind as they disappeared over a ridge. Carlitos Pia Easy whispered, "They have all our lives in their hands now." The trek was a venture into the unknown. Nando, Roberto, and Tintin soon realized just how deceiving the mountains had been. From the fuselage, the nearby ridge, which they called the summit, looked like it might be the top, promising a way out. But as they climbed for hours, the peak seemed to retreat further away, always above them. The thin air burned in their lungs. At over 12,000 feet, every step was laborious. They camped after the first day only a short distance from the crash site, digging a shallow cave in the snow and crawling into their 3-man sleeping bag. The first night out was brutally cold, even with their makeshift gear. They shivered uncontrollably in the minus 30 degrees Celsius cold, their breath freezing in mid-air, yet they endured. On the second day, Tintin, who was larger and eating more of the supplies, began to worry that their rations wouldn't last if all 3 continued. Nando made a tough decision. Antonio Vicentin would turn back on the morning of the 3rd day. They all agreed it would conserve food and give Nando and Roberto a better chance to go further. Fighting tears, Tintin hugged his 2 friends and slid back down toward the fuselage, promising to return with the helicopters once he found civilization. Now, it was just Nando and Roberto, alone against the mountains with perhaps 3 days' worth of food. For 3 grueling days, Parrado and Canessa climbed upward, scaling a slope of nearly 60 degrees in parts. They traversed ice fields and rocky outcrops, each step a victory of will over exhaustion. On December 15th, they finally reached the top of the ridge, 14,500 feet above sea level. The 2 men stood at the summit, hearts pounding, and gazed out hoping to see green valleys of Chile. Instead, their blood ran cold. In every direction, towering snowy peaks extended to the horizon. They had climbed not out of the Andes, but into its very heart. Roberto's face fell. Chile was out there somewhere, but which way? All they saw were dozens of mountains, like the one they stood on. It was a crushing moment. Overwhelmed by what lay ahead, Roberto Canessa felt despair creeping in, but Nando Parrado would not let him succumb. He put his hand on Roberto's shoulder and spoke words that would go down in survival history. "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me," Nando told Canessa firmly. In that instant, something shifted in Roberto. He looked at his friend, sunburned, lips cracked, eyes blazing with determination, and nodded. "You and I are friends, Nando," Roberto replied. "We have been through so much. Now, let's go die together." It was a pact of courage between them. If death was to come, they would meet it on their own terms, fighting to the last. With renewed resolve, the pair continued climbing and then descending ridge after ridge. Each time they conquered one summit, another loomed ahead. But as they moved westward, the snow began to lessen. By the fourth and fifth days, they noticed patches of rock and even a bit of scrub poking through the snow. The air warmed under the high-altitude sun, and the nights grew slightly more tolerable. They were now beyond the highest peaks. Nando, who had been mentally mapping their route, believed they must be nearing Chile. He was driven by an image in his mind, his father's face, waiting for him, and the desire to not let his father lose him after losing his wife and daughter. Roberto, for his part, was fueled by a sense of purpose. He repeated to himself the names of his fiancée and his family, like a mantra pushing him onward. After more than a week of trekking, their food was gone and their bodies were on the verge of collapse. Roberto had lost nearly half his body weight since the crash. Nando was bleeding from cracked lips and struggling with snow blindness, his eyes red and teary from the glare. On the 10th day of their journey, around December 21st, the landscape began to change dramatically. The endless snowfields gave way to patches of green. They saw grass, then a trickle of water, then a flowing river far below. For the first time in 72 days, they saw signs of human presence, cows grazing on a distant hillside. This sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. With their last strength, Nando and Roberto descended into a valley following the river, hoping it would lead to people. That afternoon, Roberto spotted something moving across the river, a man on horseback. It was a Chilean arriero muleteer named Sergio Catalan, tending cattle in the remote Andean foothills. Nando and Roberto jumped and waved frantically, yelling in Spanish, "Amigo, friend." Catalan, on the opposite bank of the roaring river, could hardly believe his eyes. Two gaunt, bearded figures, clothes in tatters, hollering that they were survivors of a plane crash. The river's noise made conversation impossible, so Catalan signaled he would return manana tomorrow. Desperate, Nando and Roberto pleaded that they couldn't wait. Catalan motioned for them to stay put. He returned shortly, and from his saddle flung a loaf of bread across the river, along with a pen and paper wrapped in plastic. Nando snatched up the supplies. Bread, real food. Roberto, who hadn't tasted bread in over 2 months, crossed himself and took a grateful bite, tears in his eyes. Nando hurriedly scribbled a note on the paper, his hands shaking. "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have 14 friends wounded up there. We need help. We don't have any food. Please come to get us, fast." He wrapped the note around a rock and threw it back across the river. Catalan read it and looked up with shock and compassion. He gave them a thumbs up and pointed down the valley, shouting, "Volver, I will return." The exhausted duo understood. Help was finally on the way. True to his word, Sergio Catalan rode through that night, covering many miles to alert the authorities. On the morning of December 22, 1972, he reached a police station in Punta Negro, Chile, and presented the crumpled note. The local police were stunned and quickly sent word to the army. Soon, a rescue operation was underway. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa were found and picked up by Chilean rescue teams on a road later that day. By then, they had walked over 50 kilometers from the crash site. The two men, skeletal and dressed in rags, politely introduced themselves. "We are passengers from the plane that crashed in the Andes 72 days ago," Nando explained calmly to the astonished Chilean officer who found them. The officer's eyes went wide in recognition of the news stories from 2 months prior. It had been assumed no one survived that crash. Despite extreme fatigue, Nando and Roberto refused to rest until the rescue of their friends was arranged. They provided coordinates and guided the Chilean authorities on how to find the remaining survivors. The Chilean Air Force scrambled helicopters to attempt a high-altitude rescue at the crash site. But the first challenge was locating it among the vast mountains. That afternoon, Nando Parrado himself flew in one of the helicopters, directing the pilot over the peaks to the exact valley by memory. The sight that greeted the rescuers was astounding. Far below, on a snowy expanse, was the wreckage of a plane, and next to it, tiny figures waving up at them. Down at the fuselage, the 14 survivors who had stayed behind had been waiting, anxiously scanning the skies for days. On December 22nd, just after lunch, a roar of rotor blades echoed through the valley. Roy Harley was the first to spot the helicopters approaching, and he yelled for everyone to come out. After 72 days of darkness, starvation, and death, salvation was literally descending from the sky. The survivors ran into the snow, weak but exhilarated, waving frantically. The helicopters had difficulty landing on the rough terrain and thin air. They could only set down a few hundred meters away. Chilean rescuers on foot approached the group. "Somos amigos. Helicopteros 1, shouted reassuringly. Upon realizing these strangers were indeed rescuers, some of the survivors collapsed to their knees sobbing, their ordeal finally over. The first rescuer to reach the group was Lieutenant Jorge Ponce Ramirez of the Chilean Army. He could barely believe his eyes. The survivors were gaunt, sunburned, with long unkempt hair and beards, looking more like wild men than the clean-cut rugby players in the photos circulated in October. Yet they were very much alive, smiling through tears, embracing the rescuers with what little strength they had. "Gracias a Dios, thanks be to God," cried Javier Mathal, who had lost his wife Liliana in the avalanche, as he fell into the arms of a rescuer. Carlos Paez kept repeating, "I can't believe you're here. I can't believe it's over." There were not enough helicopters to take everyone at once, and due to the late hour and altitude, the pilots decided to evacuate in 2 rounds. Half of the survivors were airlifted out on December 22nd before dusk, including the most sick and weak. The remaining survivors, about 7 of them, had to endure one more freezing night on the mountain, but this time with the comforting knowledge that rescue was assured the next morning. Chilean searchers stayed with them overnight, sharing real food and warm blankets for the first time. On December 23, 1972, the helicopters returned at first light and ferried the last survivors to safety. After 72 days, the ordeal was finally over. In total, 16 survivors came down from that mountain, sunken-eyed, malnourished, some with hair gone white from stress, but alive. They were immediately flown to hospitals in San Fernando and Santiago, Chile. As each stretcher was unloaded, doctors and nurses gasped at the sight. These men had survived the impossible. Family members, who had flown to Chile as soon as they got word, rushed to the hospital wards. Nando Parrado was reunited with his father, Soler Parrado, in an embrace that seemed to last forever. A moment of profound joy, laced with the sorrow of the family they lost. Roberto Canessa, delirious from exhaustion, asked a nurse if he could finally have a glass of ice-cold Pepsi, a bizarre craving he'd held onto while stranded. The nurse laughed and obliged. News of the survivors' discovery spread around the globe like wildfire. "Miracle in the Andes" headlined newspapers worldwide. The public was astonished and elated that these people had beaten such unfathomable odds. The media descended on the hospital, eager to hear their story. Uruguay, which had been mourning them, erupted in celebration. It felt like a Christmas miracle, as the rescue happened just 2 days before Christmas Eve. The survivors, however, were in no state for press conferences. They were weak and traumatized, and many of them asked to first speak with their families and a priest, quietly, among themselves and their loved ones. They confessed the darkest part of their survival, that they had eaten human flesh. They feared how the world would judge them. Uruguay's authorities and the survivors' families, upon hearing this, responded with overwhelming compassion. As Dr. Enrique Algorta, father of survivor Pedro Algorta, told his son, "You did what you had to do. I am so proud of your strength." The parents and siblings of those who had perished also offered their grace. Many said they took solace knowing their loved one's body helped save dear friends. Canessa later said, "I had to go to their families later to explain," describing how he personally sought forgiveness from the bereaved. In every case, those families embraced him and the others, understanding the necessity. As the survivors recovered in the hospital, the world's media clamored for details. Initially, officials issued gentle statements that the survivors had done what was necessary to live, without elaboration. But sensational rumors were already spreading. On December 26th, 2 photographs taken by Chilean mountaineers who aided the rescue leaked to the press. One showed the wreckage littered with human bones and a half-eaten human leg. The gruesome image made the front page of Chilean newspapers. Instantly, the survivors' brave tale was tainted with lurid fascination. Words like cannibals splashed across headlines, often without context or understanding. The public that had hailed the miracle now grappled with the shock of how that miracle was achieved. To address the swirling questions, the survivors held a press conference in Montevideo, not long after returning home. Pale and visibly nervous, they recounted their story for journalists, holding nothing back. In a packed room, they explained the group's pact, how each person had given consent that their body could serve the others. They spoke of the agony of the decision and compared their actions to those of Jesus at the Last Supper, noting that Christ offered his flesh and blood to save others. This comparison, while startling to some, framed the act in terms their society could understand, as an ultimate sacrifice of love. When one reporter bluntly asked, "Did you eat human flesh?" Roberto Canessa answered with dignity, "Yes, we did." Another journalist asked if they felt like cannibals. Nando Parrado responded firmly, saying that term was wrong. Cannibals kill for food. We did not kill anyone. We survived off those who had died in the crash. There is a difference. It's just terminology. His words helped shift the perspective from one of moral outrage to empathy for their plight. Once the full story was understood, a wave of support and sympathy washed over the survivors. The Uruguayan Catholic Church officially stated that the survivors were not to be condemned, reinforcing that preserving life in such extreme circumstances is not a sin. The Pope himself later sent blessings to the 16 young men. Far from being pariahs, they returned home as national heroes who exemplified faith, unity, and the will to live. Crowds gathered at the airport in Montevideo on December 28, 1972, when the survivors finally came home. They cheered and cried as the skinny, smiling figures walked or were carried off the plane. One by one, the 16 survivors were reunited with their extended families, hugging fathers, mothers, siblings, fiancés, many of whom had never given up hope, even when the world did. In the months that followed, however, survivors' guilt and trauma took a toll. Some of the young men had nightmares of the crash and the avalanche for years. A few struggled to adjust to normal life. Eduardo Strauss said, "Reintegrating back into society was hard. It took years." Many had flashbacks whenever they were cold or hungry, remembering those awful nights. To cope, the survivors leaned on each other. They formed a lifelong brotherhood, meeting frequently and even addressing each other's parents as family. "We were bonded by the most extraordinary event of our lives," Nando Parrado reflected. "No one else on earth could understand what we went through." They also sought meaning from their suffering. Over time, several survivors chose paths of helping others. Roberto Canessa, for example, became a prominent pediatric cardiologist, saving children's lives, a calling directly inspired by witnessing death on the mountain, as he wrote in his memoir. The story of Flight 571 became a legend, retold in books, documentaries, and movies. The survivors themselves contributed to these accounts, wanting the truth and spirit of their experience to be understood. Piers Paul Reed's 1974 book Alive brought their story to the world. And decades later, survivors like Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa wrote their own memoirs, Miracle in the Andes and I Had to Survive, respectively, to share deeper insights. They emphasized not the gore, but the love, teamwork, and resilience that defined those 72 days. Death has an opposite, but the opposite is not mere living. The opposite of death is love, Nando wrote. Finding profound lessons in the ordeal, over time, the survivors found that their story held a powerful message for others. Eduardo Strout noted that when people hear their story, they get so many positive things for their lives, often reconsidering their own will to live or overcome challenges. Indeed, the legacy of Flight 571 became one of hope and inspiration. Their experience has been taught in survival courses, leadership seminars, and even theology classes, exploring the limits of human endurance and ethics. We suffered so much, Strauss said, but 47 years later, it became something so positive for so many people. In 2022, the 50th anniversary of the crash, the remaining survivors, 14 of the 16, were still alive then, gathered at a memorial service at the very same Andes Valley that had nearly claimed their lives. They stood together, now men in their late 60s and 70s, and remembered those who died so that they could live. They shared a quiet moment of gratitude and brotherhood on the mountain that had been their prison and their salvation. When asked by a reporter about their extraordinary survival, Roberto Canessa stated simply, "We have no regrets. We did what we needed to do." He further reflected that he would have considered it an honor had he died and his body been used by his friends to live. Such is the perspective that only those who faced death so intimately can truly understand. The story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, the miracle in the Andes, is not just about a plane crash or cannibalism. It is about the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. It is the story of young people who were pushed far beyond the boundaries of normal morality and endurance, yet somehow emerged with their humanity intact. These 16 survivors endured the death of friends and family, extreme cold, avalanches, and the torment of starvation. They had moments of despair and fear, but they also experienced incredible solidarity, courage, and love. As Nando Parrado eloquently put it, love is our only weapon. Only love can turn mere life into a miracle and draw precious meaning from suffering and fear. In the end, their love for each other, the willingness to sacrifice and to fight for one another's survival, is what carried them through 72 days on the mountain and beyond. The 1972 Andes survivors taught the world that impossible odds can be overcome when people refuse to give up on life. Their ordeal asks us to consider what we might do in extremity, and whether any of us, placed in their snowbound shoes, would have done differently. It challenges the limits of morality and the instinct to survive. But above all, their story leaves us with a profound sense of awe. Against nature's cruelest trials, they met death and said, "Not today." And through ingenuity, faith, and sheer willpower, they achieved the unimaginable. As the sun sets over the Andes today, a simple iron cross stands at the crash site, erected by the survivors in memory of their loved ones. The wind whispers through the peaks, telling a story of tragedy and triumph that happened half a century ago. We remember Flight 571 not for the horror its survivors endured, but for the remarkable testament to life that they became. 16 men walked out of those mountains, carrying a message of hope. Even in the harshest isolation, the human spirit can prevail. This has been the true story of the Andes flight disaster, a story of despair, of difficult choices, of friendship and faith, and ultimately, of survival against all odds. The legacy of these survivors will forever remind us what it means to be truly alive. 72 days of ice, hunger, and heartbreak ended because 16 ordinary people chose extraordinary courage. If their fight for life inspired you, Tap that like button to help this story reach others who might need a spark of hope today. Have thoughts about the moral choices they faced? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and can't wait to hear your perspective. Know someone who loves true survival tales. Share this video so the miracle of Flight 571 can keep lighting fires of resilience around the world. And if you crave more real-life adventures that prove the impossible is possible, hit subscribe and ring the bell. New stories drop every week. Until our next journey together, remember, when the world turns to ice, it's the warmth we keep inside that carries us home. Stay brave, stay curious, and keep the hope alive.